It is a big fun day and a fun big day, 'cause it's story time, it's story time, it's story time, it's story time with Uncle Scotty. Hey, what's happening? This is Story Time with Uncle Scotty. I am your host. So happy to be here. Uncle Scotty. We have our own mugs now because we've become so successful. Don't forget, hydration is important. Also important, washing our hands. We especially need to wash our hands if we happen to have a big bowl of popcorn we want to enjoy during story time. The other key thing is to not eat with our mouths full. Don't eat with your mouth full. And be sure to wash your hands after you eat the popcorn. Always be washing your hands. Hey, you probably know today is a day for a new story that we're going to start. Put on my trusty glasses here. If you are enjoying story time, you can hear the plane going overhead. If you're enjoying story time, I do encourage you to check us out on Patreon in case you're interested in your own mug or perhaps your own bookmark. You can get some details there. Or maybe you want to know about some stories that are going to appear here, but could appear for you and only you. So check that out, patreon.com, and give it a look. Now, today, very exciting day. We have a new story to begin. Some call it a series of stories. Drum roll, please. Our new story is Sideways Stories from Wayside School by Louis Sacher, Louis Sacher, Louis Sacher, Louis S. Now, I was excited to pick this book to read next because when I was, I believe in 5th grade, maybe 6th grade, I was either 10 or 11 years old, I found this book in the library and I was curious about it because of the cover. The cover looks very peculiar. Tall building, that woman, these surprised kids. And I started reading it and it made me laugh a lot, made me think a lot. And so now I am excited to read this book for the second time and only the second time to you. So shall we begin? Let's begin. Sideways Stories from Wayside School. Sideways Stories from Wayside School. You may have a question. Why am I holding up a sheet of paper instead of a book? Great question. It's because I happen to have this book printed out on papers. And since we are at a time that I want to limit myself going to a store, I decided I could pull these out from a previous project and read them just like a book. Because what is a book? A bunch of pieces of paper with words on them. And is this a book? Who's to say that this is not a book? Not me. Maybe you? Let me know if you don't think this is a book. We'll talk about it. Anyway, Sideways Stories from Wayside School. Chapter 1. Breaking news, breaking news. Wow, breaking news. We've almost forgot a very important part of this book, which is the introduction. How are we supposed to start this book without the introduction? Uncle Scotty, if you give me one moment, I need to read this introduction before you go any further. Introduction. This book contains 30 stories about the children and teachers at Wayside School. But before we get to them, there is something you ought to know so that you don't get confused. Wayside School was accidentally built sideways. It was supposed to only be 1 story high with 30 classrooms in a row. 30. Instead, it is 30 stories high, 30. With 1 classroom on each story. The builder, construction person, said he was very sorry. The children at Wayside like having a sideways school. They have an extra large playground because it's just 1 building. Everything else is a playground. The children and teachers described in this book all go to the class on the top floor. So there are 30 stories from the 30th story of Wayside School. It has been said that these stories are strange and silly. That is probably true. However, when I told stories about you to the children at Wayside, they thought you were strange and silly. And that is probably also true. Thank you for tuning into this introduction. Chapter 1, Mrs. Gorf. Mrs. Gorf had a long tongue and pointed ears. She was the meanest teacher in Wayside School. She taught the class on the 30th story. Their class is 30 stories up. "If you children are bad," she warned, "or if you get a problem wrong, I'll wiggle my ears, stick out my tongue, and turn you into apples." Mrs. Gorf didn't like children, but she loved apples. Joe couldn't add. He couldn't even count. But he knew that if he answered a problem wrong, he'd be turned into an apple. So he copied from John. He didn't like to cheat, but Miss Gorf had never taught him how to add. One day, Mrs. Gorf caught Joe copying John's paper. She wiggled her ears, first her right ear, then her left one, stuck out her tongue, and turned Joe into an apple. Then she turned John into an apple for letting Joe cheat. "Hey, that isn't fair," said Todd. "John was only trying to help a friend." Miss Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one, and then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Todd into an apple. "Does anyone else have an opinion?" she asked. Nobody said a word. Mrs. Gorf laughed and placed the 3 apples on her desk. Stephen started to cry. He couldn't help it. He was scared. "I do not allow crying in my classroom," said Mrs. Gorf. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, and then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Stephen into an apple. And for the rest of the day, the children were absolutely quiet. And when they went home, they were too scared to even talk to their parents. But Joe, John, Todd, and Stephen couldn't go home. Miss Gorf just left them on her desk. They were able to talk to each other, but they didn't have much to say. Their parents were very worried. They didn't know where their children were. Nobody seemed to know. The next day, Kathy was late for school. As soon as she walked in, Mrs. Gorf turned her into an apple. Paul sneezed during class. Achoo! He was turned into an apple. "Paul, I hope you sneezed into your elbow and I hope you washed your hands afterwards. You actually shouldn't be at school if you're sneezing." Nancy said, "God bless you," when Paul sneezed. Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one, and then her left one, and stuck out her tongue and turned Nancy into an apple. Terrence fell out of his chair. He was turned into an apple. Mauricia tried to run away. She was halfway to the door when Mrs. Gorf's right ear began to wiggle. When she reached the door, Mrs. Gorf's left ear wiggled. Mauricia opened the door and had one foot outside when Mrs. Gorf stuck out her tongue. Mauricia turned into an apple. Mrs. Gorf picked up the apple from the floor and put it on her desk with the others. Then a funny thing happened. Mrs. Gorf turned around and fell over on a piece of chalk. That's not right. She fell over a piece of chalk. A little piece of chalk made her fall over. The 3 Erics laughed. 1, 2, 3 Erics. They were turned into apples. Miss Gorf now had a dozen apples on her desk. Joe, John, Todd, Stephen, Kathy, Paul, Nancy, Terrence, Mauricia, and the 3 Erics. Eric Fry, Eric Bacon, and Eric Ovens. Lewis, the yard teacher, walked into the classroom. He had missed the children at recess. He had heard that Mrs. Gorf was a mean teacher, so he came up to investigate. He saw the 12 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. "I must be wrong," he thought. "She must be a good teacher if so many children bring her apples." He walked back down to the playground. The next day, a dozen more children were turned into apples. Lewis, the yard teacher, came back into the room. He saw 24 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. There were only 3 children left in the class. "She must be the best teacher in the world," he thought. By the end of the week, all of the children were apples. Mrs. Gorf was very happy. "Now I can go home," she said. "I don't have to teach anymore. I won't have to walk up 30 flights of stairs ever again." "You're not going anywhere!" shouted Todd. He jumped off the desk and bopped Mrs. Gorf on the nose. Ah. The rest of the apples followed. Mrs. Gorf fell on the floor. The apples jumped all over her. "Stop!" she shouted, "or I'll turn you into applesauce." But the apples didn't stop, and Mrs. Gorf could do nothing about it. Turn us back into children, Todd demanded. Miss Gorf had no choice. She stuck out her tongue, wiggled her ears, this time her left one first, then her right, and turned the apples back into children. All right, said Mauricia. Let's go get Louis. He'll know what to do. No, screamed Miss Gorf. I'll turn you back into apples. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, and then her left, and stuck out her tongue. But Ginny held up a mirror, and Mrs. Gorf turned herself into an apple. The children didn't know what to do. They didn't have a teacher. Even though Mrs. Gorf was mean, they didn't think it was right to leave her as an apple. But none of them knew how to wiggle their ears. I don't know how to wiggle my ears. Do you know how to wiggle your ears? Never was able to do it. Maybe that's why I'm not a teacher. Louis, the yard teacher, walked in. Where's Mrs. Gorf? He asked. Nobody said a word. Boy, am I hungry, said Louis. I don't think Mrs. Gorf would mind if I had this apple. After all, she always has so many. He picked up the apple, which was really Mrs. Gorf, shined it up on his shirt, and ate it. And here, we can see. Here's Mrs. Gorf, looking really mean, turning somebody into an apple. Here's some of the students, some of the kids who are apples. And then we have the teacher, formerly known as Mrs. Gorf, now known as Apple Core, being thrown into the trash can after Louis ate her. Should we do one more chapter? We'll do one more chapter? Let's see. Let's do it. Let's do it. It's a new book. It's a new day. It's new fun. Chapter 2, Mrs. Jewls. Mrs. Jewls had a terribly nice face. She stood at the bottom of Wayside School and looked up. She was supposed to teach the class on the 30th story. The children on the 30th story were very scared. They had never told anybody what had happened to Mrs. Gorf. They hadn't had a teacher for 3 days. Ding. They were afraid of what their new teacher would be like. They had heard she'd be a terribly nice teacher. They had never had a nice teacher. They were terribly afraid of nice teachers. Mrs. Jewls walked up the winding, creaking staircase all the way up to the 30th story. She was also afraid. She was afraid of the children. She had heard that they would be horribly cute children. She had never taught cute children. She was horribly afraid of cute children. She opened the door to the classroom. She was terribly nice. The children could just tell by looking at her. Mrs. Jewls looked at the children. They were horribly cute. In fact, they were much too cute to be children. I don't believe it, said Mrs. Jewls. It's a room full of monkeys. The children looked at each other. They didn't see any monkeys. This is ridiculous, said Mrs. Jewls. Just ridiculous. I walked all the way up 30 flights of stairs for nothing but a class of monkeys. What did they think I am? I am a teacher, not a zookeeper. The children looked at her. They didn't know what to say. Todd scratched his head. Oh, I'm sorry, said Mrs. Jewls. Please don't get me wrong. I have nothing against monkeys. It's just that I was expecting children. I like monkeys, I really do. Why, I'm sure we can play all kinds of monkey games. What are you talking about? Asked Todd. Mrs. Jewls nearly fell out of her chair. Well, you know, what do you know? A talking monkey. Tomorrow I'll bring you a banana. My name is Todd, said Todd. The children were flabbergasted. They all raised their hands. I'm sorry, said Mrs. Jewls, but I don't have enough bananas for all of you. I didn't expect this. Next week I'll bring in a whole bushel. And here you can see Mrs. Jewls. The children, the horribly cute children, looking like monkeys. I don't want a banana, said Calvin. I'm not a monkey. Would you like a peanut? Asked Mrs. Jewls. I think I might have a bag of peanuts in my purse. Wait a second. Yes, there it is. Thanks, said Calvin. Calvin liked peanuts. Allison stood up. I'm not a monkey, she said. I'm a girl. My name's Allison. And so is everyone else. Mrs. Jewls was shocked. Do you mean to tell me that every monkey in here is named Allison? No, said Ginny. She means we are all children. My name is Ginny. No, said Mrs. Jewls. You are much too cute for children. Jason raised his hand. Yes, said Mrs. Jewls. The chimpanzee in the red shirt. My name is Jason, said Jason, and I'm not a chimpanzee. You are too small to be a gorilla, said Mrs. Jewls. I'm a boy, said Jason. You're not a monkey? Asked Mrs. Jewls. No, said Jason. And the rest of the class? They're not monkeys either? Asked Mrs. Jewls. No, said Allison. This is what we've been trying to tell you. I don't know, said Mrs. Jewls. Do monkeys know that they're monkeys? I don't know, said Allison. I'm not a monkey. No, I suppose you're not, said Mrs. Jewls. Okay, in that case, we have a lot of work to do. Reading, writing, subtraction, addition, spelling. Everybody take out a piece of paper. We will have a test now. Jason tapped Todd on the shoulder. He said, You want to know something? I liked it better when she thought we were monkeys. I know, said Todd. I guess it means now she won't bring me a banana. There will be no talking in class, said Mrs. Jewls. She wrote Todd's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. And we will find out what happens next on Next Time with Storytime with Uncle Scotty. I have been your host, Uncle Scotty, for this episode of Storytime with Uncle Scotty. Special thank you to our sponsor, Time. What is Storytime without time? Story. Don't forget to check us out on Patreon if you would like. Enjoy your popcorn, wash your hands, and I will see you next time. Bye.